Okay, we're looking at part two here of the dissertation done by Dr. Kenneth Harl of Tulane University on Proto-Indo-Europeans and their effects on the East and India and so on, and of course the origins and beginning of civilization. We are at a prehistoric level here. We are much before the Sumerians, even at this point when we're talking about this. This is, I guess, after Göbekli Tepe and not too long after the times of Catalhoyuk and related civilizations over there. And this is a spreading out, or a diaspora that had come through here and into the Tarim Basin. And we're just going to go from here. This is backing it up a little bit, but I just want to recap and continue.
Language family, which are the language families of Turkish and the Mongolian languages, of what seem to be these early vehicles. There's evidence also from burials as far west as Poland, sometime before 2000 BC. Some scholars would like to push this back, to 3000 BC. We really don't have the evidence. They perfect the making of the light chariot. And these chariots acted as platforms in battle. Men could ride in. They could attack infantry armies from the flanks. They could ride across the front of an infantry army. They could use a version of the composite bow I described, which is later.
It caused chaos quite a bit for people to use these things. You know, before it was kind of a slower thing. You're having to run with donkeys. I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but it's hard to keep a donkey in a run and to do things and stuff, whereas a horse is much more viable and goes much faster. In doing so, if you had a four-wheel cart and you tried to take a turn, it would flip and roll on you real quick. Could cause a problem like what happened to King Tut. Well, that happened if you watch Ben-Hur and things like that. It shows you the problem that come with it. And of course, what came along with these people too, these ancient hunters, the hike and the Hyksos that had come into Egypt and brought them, was the horses, the chariots, a recurved bow, and a lot of technology that helped to take them and perpetuate them. At the time, they could have easily have been taken over by the Hyksos, but they had no inclination to do so, as much as just to have a place during a great time of a lot of famine that was going on in drought. But let's continue. Let's go through this.
Used by mounted horsemen to disorganize the enemy, and that gave the nomads a new military edge, as well as a mobility for their families, as well as better stock raising. That was the third vital innovation on the steppes, perhaps by 2000 BC, 2500 BC, and by virtue of that, the carts, the stock raising, the riding of horses to herd animals, and the light chariots, the Indo-European speakers started to migrate both west and east. Now, the migrations west will take the ancestors of the speakers of many European languages into the forest zones of Western and Central Europe. It will take them into the Mediterranean world and give birth to the Greek language, to the various Romance languages. In Western Europe, to Germanic and Celtic languages. Those that stay in the original steppe zones and move into the forests of Russia become the ancestors of the Baltic and Slavic peoples.
And you can see here the spreading out of this original concept here, and of course down through Anatolia. And what they're not describing is the other one that had gone straight down and into Egypt and the edge of Africa. And of course that was a bouncing in and out that had gone on since way before this in primordial times.
But there was also a great eastern expansion. And the majority of Indo-European speakers who spread east spoke versions of what is classified as the Iranian language family, or more properly, the Indo-Iranian languages.
Or even more properly, but not used anymore, the ancient Aryan languages.
These people migrated out of that original homeland on the western steppes of the great arm of Eurasia to steppe lands north of the Aral Sea, and then drifted down into Transoxiana, into regions called by the Greeks Bactria and Margiane. And in there, they settled and brought their distinct technology of chariots, the use of domesticated horses, and their language. And that complex in Transoxiana was the original homeland for the ancestors of what became the Iranian speakers and the speakers of Indic languages that gave rise to Sanskrit and eventually to the languages of modern India today, Hindi, Urdu, and what we know. And that migration represented a very important migration of steppe nomadic peoples from the original core area east. Other Iranian speakers went farther east across the Central Asian steppes, as far as the upper course of the Yellow River, the Wangho, in the Ordos area, which is this great loop in the Yellow River, a desert arid area that fades into the Gobi, and they settled in that region.
And they find the Tarim Basin monies down there and then up into this area here. And there's a lot of pyramids that are found in this area too, and ancient Kurgan burials and so on that lead one to believe that perhaps not all of it was ancient Chinese, seeing as how it predates them in the area. Well, let's continue though. Ordos, and you see where we are in another river valley system.
And therefore, the peopling of the steppes was largely a phenomenon brought about by Indo-European speakers moving out of that heartland, brought about first by the introduction of chariots in the late Bronze Age, and Middle and Late Bronze Age, and later by the perfection of riding horses with saddles, which led to another distribution farther east.
Now, there is depictions where they show ancient people on horseback going way back in the thousands of years in old red ochre drawn pictures and so on off of it, but to have perfected a saddle is something else. Now, the earliest saddles they had were basically a blanket stuck onto them, much like the old Indian saddles where they ran what you would refer to as bareback, and they would run horses along with them and get them used to it, even putting weight on their back to get them used to that and running around with it. Then they would put somebody on them, you know, and horses can really go crazy and buck whenever you put somebody on them and things like that, and have to break horses and all this cowboy stuff. This one actually has stirrups already. There was a time in between this where they didn't have a stirrup, and right before that they had these leather straps. Most of them though don't seem to have lasted. They seem to have rotted away somehow. Let's look further into this though. It also, by the way, gives them a posture of setting up. And if you look at some of these elder saddles that are made for warring and charioting and things, and to go along with infantry, they are set up and pulled into a stance where you are made to be able to shoot from it. Not necessarily other saddles that are for riding, long distance, things like that. There's quite a few forms that can be found of these.
So, in contrast to the historic periods, where we have good written records, the movement of nomadic peoples across Eurasia in the earliest period is west to east. And that's an important point I wish to stress, because that's going to have major repercussions in the upcoming lectures. Now, the early Iranian and Indic speakers who had moved into that area of Transoxiana and northern Iran, those people were in close association for a long time. Scholars who study the Rig Vedas, which are the earliest texts of India in Sanskrit, and the Avesta, particularly the earlier passages of the Avesta, which is a very antique language of Iranian. Scholars have noted close association of these two languages, similarities in cultural patterns, whereby the early Iranians and early Indian peoples, the ancestors of these people, had a sense of caste. They also worshipped a lot of the same gods. And as a result, they broke off in two directions, one to the west, one to the east, and in so doing, they evolved into the later Indian and Iranian peoples. Among the common features we know about is the use of horse sacrifices, the use of soma, which is an alcoholic beverage, in order to get inspired contact with the ancestral spirits.
Not necessarily. Soma is known to contain cannabis, ephedra, and opium, poppy. And sure, you can mix it with an alcoholic drink. It's mixed into wines and things like that, but that's what soma is, and it's found in quite a few places. That's how they can verify some of these. There's horse burials, there's chariots, there's this pot that they apparently used to make all this out of. They've scraped it, analyzed it, and sure enough, it's what it is. So,
A branch of these people, generally known as the Mitanni, a military elite, and known in the text as the Marianana, or the young charioteers,
and that has another connotation to where the word marijuana comes from, but let's continue. This is going into the Mitanni people, which are quite important here later, pulling off a centralized spot in Anatolia, which is hard between the empires that they do so, and in the process become great friends with the Egyptians, which call them brothers, and there's even breedings and stuff between them found in the Marna tablets and things like that, and women and so on, you know, and princesses trading around and things like that. But let's look.
Each of these people moved actually into the Middle East, into northern Iraq, and they're known from Hittite texts. They were known as great horsemen, and they brought the horse and light chariot into northern Mesopotamia sometime around 1600 BC. Those texts were quite a revelation. It shows that the Indo-European speakers of the Mitanni spoke a language very close to Vedic and Avestan Iranian.
And also, though, I want you to notice where they are. They're literally just in the top part of what used to be ancient Sumerian. Right? So this Tigris and Euphrates here. I mean, Ur was right down here. All these places lead up, and Nippur is right up in here. And then they lead up right into Anatolia and these sites. People seem to think that it's so separated over there. And while this point here is quite separated from this point here in Egypt, this point here to this point here is a little bit closer. And then this all was Sumerians.
And those migrations represent an important migration of Middle and Late Bronze Age that brought Indo-European speakers into the Central Steppes, into Iran, and even into the Middle East. The next major migration of nomadic peoples really came as a result of another breakthrough. And that was learning to ride horses in battle, on saddles. The development of the composite bow, which I had talked about in the very first lecture. Sometime after 1000 BC, nomadic peoples on the steppes, almost certainly Iranian speakers, known as Scythians in classical sources, and described in detail by Herodotus, they perfected a type of saddle. It didn't yet have stirrups. Some scholars surmise perhaps it had primitive leather stirrups, but they create a saddle that could sit on these superior horses they've been breeding. I guess they, something like 13, 14 hands high would be the distance in modern terms. And these horses had a saddle with a wood frame, leather cushions, eventually a tree or a back on it that allows the man to sit up with a composite bow. And
they made different kinds of horses too. Or in the first one, we looked at ones that really look, the steppe horses there, the natural style that are up north, have a woolly texture to them and stuff, and quite thick, and they can make it through the winter quite well. We got into the point of making thoroughbreds and styles like that, quarter horses that could go very fast but for short distances of time, thoroughbreds that could go longer distance of time, you know, bred to be things like the old you know, back and forth messaging and things like that could go with people, and you would trade those out along the migration route. It wouldn't work as well with a quarter horse. You'd have to run and trot and run and trot. But a lot of different types of horses. And then there's Lipizzaner stallions that we know of today, and the great Arabian horses with all their heritage and stuff that goes on, that comes out of the Persian people that were there for quite some time too. And so you get these variations in style, and it's known that this horse that they came out with was quite a dominant horse. And of course, these people had been messing with genetics and domesticating animals for quite some time already at this point. It's not something new to them. In fact, doing the same type of thing with people, we'll look at later.
That superior saddle, that bow, allowed for the development of horse archers. Once this technique of warfare was known, it led to that second migration of Indo-Europeans, Iranian speakers, from the Central Asian steppes into the Tarim Basin, where the Tocharians had eventually settled. It led to settlements farther east to the fringes of the Chinese Empire. Scythians, or Iranian speakers, from the southern Russian steppes, from the western arm, invaded into the historic civilizations. The first disastrous records we have of this are a group of people known as the Cimmerians, who apparently crossed over the Caucasus Mountains.
Well, this is where our word chimera comes from also. And it was a thing that they had found in the mountains here. They had found some triceratops before too, and out over in this range, I don't know which mountain range, out in these mountain ranges too, and talked about them. And so it was one of those things like, oh my God, there must be dragons there. We found a dead one because we saw the head exposed, just like the ancient Cyclops thing appears to now be ancient elephant heads that they had found on the island, which they talk about in the stories itself. I wanted to show you here, though, we were just looking at the Saqqah, and they're way over here going out of range now, and how the Medes and the Persians and everybody were the same people. And of course this is listed as Aryans, and all these people right here at one time really were listed in that same way, and then they started changing their names, and Cimmerians, and this goes back to that Conan thing that I like to throw in, and Conan the Cimmerian. So
invaded provinces of the Assyrian Empire, smashed into the Phrygian kingdom of King Midas of the Golden Touch and Gordian. There are records of attacks extending from 716 to 654 BC, and as a result, these Cimmerians disrupted literally the political order of the Near East, which tipped the balance to the emperors of the Assyrians, who united the Near East in the early Iron Age.
Aha!
In Transoxiana, in the Central Asian steppes, we encounter in the classical sources a group of people known as the Sakai. They settled in the region of Faragana, which I'll be talking about. They enter in...
And that's the Sakai or Sakasuni that we were talking about before a few videos back. If you haven't seen them, you might want to look that up. It leads into the Isaac and Kurgan burials, and it talks about where Isaac out of your biblical literature comes from.
To the western zones of the Tarim Basin. And so Iranian-speaking peoples moved into the Tarim Basin, and the mummies have proved that a component of Indo-European speakers, or not even Indo-European, a component of people who probably originated from Iran in the Middle East, had moved into the Tarim Basin and intermixed with the earlier Tocharian peoples, whose mummies show people with reddish hair, light eyes, whose textiles resemble very much the tartans of Scotland and Ireland. And
they do have tartans with them too. And then there's the whole empire of Tartaria that people forget about, that I'll probably have to make a few videos about it, but to encompass its thoughts and stuff. But you see these people, and how he said the other people had come in and then bred back with them, but they were originally somewhat cousins, and that led to a form of people here.
Suggests that these people, who probably emigrated during the early Bronze Age, now intermixed with a new group of nomads who came in, settled in the caravan cities, adopted eventually the civilized ways of life, and fused into the populations of these western zones that later the Chinese encountered. What is also important is that the Iranian speakers, or the Scythians, if you want to use the Greek term, spread this common way of nomadic life across the whole of the Eurasian steppes. By 500 BC, from the lower Danube to literally the borders of the Manchurian forest, we suspect that
I just want to show you again the Medes and where it is now, and at this point how they can point out where they are, and that the Persians aren't actually set apart at this point either. But 500 BC, well, they're there, right? And the Indo-Aryans that are already here in northern India, a little bit farther than what they show there.
Common steppe nomadic way of life now prevailed. That included all the carts, the diet we've talked about, the way of life. Some of these Iranian speakers have now entered into the settled zones, the most successful of the Medes and Persians, who came out of Transoxiana, settled in Iran, and the Persians would go on to build the most successful of the ancient Near Eastern empires, the Achaemenid Empire, which significantly was based on cavalry armies.
Ta-da! And a lot was, and then Alexander the Great and so on. So everybody ended up taking this on, and you can see this and how it changed everything and rippled through all of these people and through this entire, more than half the globe, and rippled back through again like a wave bouncing off a shore and coming back in a way.
Other members of that Indo-Iranian steppe people moved into India, the so-called Aryans or Indo-Aryans. They overthrew or assisted in ending, I think they really overthrew, the Indus Valley civilization known in archaeology, called by the Sumerians Malua. There are faint memories of this in the Rig Vedas. And they moved into the land of the five rivers of the upper Indus and then into the Ganges and became the people who will eventually fuse with the local populations to create classic Indian civilization.
It looks like they kind of took over and they pushed everybody out down into the southern part and then came back. And they had already had a caste system developed already before that, where the southerners are the ones that have a more Denisovan admix to them, or in a lower caste situation quite often in that set too. But let's continue.
And so these movements in what we call the early Iron Age from about 1000 to 500 BC had major consequences for the development of civilization in the Near East and India, and as we'll see in an upcoming lecture, in China as well. To defeat nomadic horse archers is to hire other nomadic horse archers. And this is what a new Shah Khusro I, who comes to the throne in 531, dies in 579. He is a contemporary of the great Byzantine or Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian. He contacts possible allies that could help him beat this new menace that controls these valuable eastern lands. And the people he contacts are known as the Turks. In 557, he enters into negotiations with the leader of the Turks. He apparently is Istemi. He is a subordinate ruler of the Western Turks. And Turks means Sky Turks. They are the newest nomadic power on the Eastern Steppes, who have rapidly expanded across all of the steppes. The Shah isn't aware of how large this confederation really is. Nonetheless, he contacts these potential allies who are north of the Jaxartes River and makes a number of arrangements. And the arrangement is essentially, we will jointly go to war against the Hephthalites and share the spoils. That is a momentous decision. When the Shah made this decision, he probably was not quite aware of how powerful these Turks would be. There is a marriage alliance. The Shah agrees to take a Turkish princess into his harem. It's a daughter of Ishtemi, and Ishtemi is not really a Ka'an. He probably holds a lesser title, Yabgu, which means he's sort of a subordinate Ka'an to his well, now at this point it's his nephew who's ruling back in the homeland.
Kind of like a duke or another thing like that, where you have a hierarchy underset under another one.
And he releases great numbers of steppe cavalry to help the Turks wipe out the Hephthalites. And as always the case with Turkish horse archers, they do their job really well. The Hephthalites exit. Their possessions in India are essentially fall into the hands of Indian rulers, and Central Asia falls under the control of the Turks. And now the Shah realizes that he has a far more powerful foe than he had ever imagined in his former allies. And quite unwittingly, Khusro I has brought into the Middle East a new people, the Turks, people speaking an Altaic language who have originated on the Eastern Steppes. Their homeland is in the Orkhon Valley. They have rapidly expanded across the steppes. They have all sorts of advantages in political and military organization that previous nomads have not done. And what the Shah has unwittingly done is opened a new chapter in the history of the steppes. He has brought in the Turks, and the Turks are destined to propel the Eurasian steppes and all of the associated civilizations out of antiquity into the early Middle Ages.
And that'll end it for this one, guys. like, share, and subscribe. But that shows you the diaspora and the way, and how where Turkish people kind of come from way up in the steppe lands, and where they ended up now, and how they got a blend going on with the current people that were living there, that were part of these other guys that we were talking about before. So yeah, like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. And if you did miss the first part, right now it should be back up in the top left-hand corner, I believe, and then something new or something that you may have missed in the top right-hand corner. Like, share, and subscribe. Peace.